Admech are my favourite army, but they don't get a whole lot of new models. I was very pleased when they got the new kill team recently, but before that, their newest model was a one-off character, the Sydonian Skatros. Because new models for them are rare, I like to take a close look at each one, and maybe think about what I can do with them, conversion-wise. And the Skatros was a bit of a disappointment for me personally. I'm not going to insult the Games Workshop design team or anything, it's just this model came out to go along with the admech codex of the edition. And looking at what else came out at the same time, the Necron Codex got 3 models, 2 great character refreshes, and another generic character with some cool effects. And for the Skatros itself, I see a few ideas in it, and I think I get what it's going for. I like the general concept of elevated gunmen, it makes sense for getting a better position for shots, but there are a few specific elements that didn't quite work for me. Going off of some styles of the chest, head, and back, there's a lot of similarities to Sicarian models, so it's like a leader version of that unit type, as the Marshal is to Scutari, but it's also a Sydonian Skatros, sharing the first part of its name with the Sydonian Dragoon, another long-legged model the army has. But unlike a lot of the related units, its legs are straight and a little plain, not the reverse knee or digitigrade style like Sicarians and the Dragoon, and they go down to just undecorated cylinders at a point. Compared to the top part of the model, which I feel gets a little clustered with the pouches, head optics, manipulator arms and bigger antennae all sticking out. That being said, I don't want to just complain, more to explain my thoughts going into this project. Because as always, things I don't like about a model are great starting points for conversions, to try and do something constructive with my qualms. I wanted to make a few different conversions of this model, as since it came out, I've had some different ideas and seen a few inspirations that I can't all fit into a single mini. The first is a rebuild of the Skatros kit, making relatively minor adjustments and part swaps to address my main concerns with the model itself. The second one is an idea for an alternative, based on some redesigns I've seen and other designs that came to mind, made by Kitbashing other admech kits. And the third and final build is a bit different, but a fun idea for a different take on the Skatros concept, based on another model that I was reminded of when first thinking of how I could convert the Skatros. Moving on to the models, and starting with the actual Skatros model, one of my main inspirations for it was a piece of art by Kitto, which addressed my main concerns of the legs and busy upper body. So my first step was to change the build of the legs, adding bends in a few places by separating the main sections and reattaching them at different positions and angles, making sure to pin them so it would be a strong connection. After readjusting how the mid and lower section of the robot leg attached, I drilled holes to glue plastic rod into, which ensured the mid and upper leg sections would be sturdy at their new angle too. Then to add a bit more detail, so the lower sections weren't down to plain cylinders, I replaced them with Sicarian taser goad pieces, which still connected to the existing Skatros ankle parts. With my main work on the legs done, I moved on to the upper body, which, like the Kitto inspiration art, I plan to smooth over fabric style details. I opted for a Scutari Ranger head in place of the usual Skatros' one, and to make the upper body match, I rolled out some green stuff until it was flat to turn into a short cloak. As I've done before, I looked to sewing patterns for shoulder capes and the like, to get an idea of the shapes I needed so I can just cut the green stuff to match, and then push it into place on the mini, minimising sculpting. It took a few attempts to get it right, and I separated it into the left and right sides, just to make sure I could focus on getting each side right without having to worry about both at the same time. Once the main part was done, I added some smaller details, like a strap across the torso to replace the pouches, a fold line around the neck, and a button or clasp. Then with the main changes I wanted to make to the mini done, I moved on to just completing the rest of it, freeing the feet from the base they're built into, and building the power pack, just changing the angle of one of the manipulator arms so it doesn't stick out quite as much, and even lines up with a hip ammo pack. For some final few details on it, I added a head camera, cut from a Traxi head, added some details to fill out and link up the adjusted leg sections, filled in the waist with some green stuff as the new leg positions meant they were angled slightly differently, and finally I mounted the exhaust but placed it upwards on the power pack, instead of having it dangling like the original model. For the next model, the initial plan was to try and make a Skatros out of similar other admech kits, Maybe giving a Sicarian legs made of the longer taser goads that Sydonian dragoons use, but I came across a few other designs and developed some different ideas I thought would make for a more interesting build. Admech units often have variants, with a few different parts going for different styles. There's the Skatari Vanguards and Rangers, and the Sydonian Dragoon and Iron Strider Ballistarius, to name a few. So where my first Skatros led more into the Scout Reconnaissance style of unit, like the Skatari Ranger, I wanted my second to look more made for direct combat, like the Vanguards. And the designs I looked to for inspiration were a few admech Walker and Skatros redesigns from Kitbashing, and also Dishonored's Tallboys. For the build, I knew I wanted to start with large mechanical legs, similar to the Sydonian Dragoon, but a bit smaller. I couldn't find any to hand, and didn't want to buy a kit just for it, so I tried to make some out of spare parts. For this kind of building, I tried to think less about specific parts, and more just looking for stuff of the right general shape, size and style, or at least parts close that I can cut or convert into what I need. What I went with were some Castellan robot thighs for the upper leg, some cut down Cataphren flamers for the midsection, and some Doomcrawler weapon barrels glued into Cataphren weapon boxes for the lower leg. To follow that, I used more taser goad parts for the back of the lower leg, which connects to part of a Cataphren weapon, and I made some feet out of Castellan ankles, with armature toe pads for the front of the foot, and Castellan arm claws for stabilizer details on the back. For the upper part, for some kind of mounted pilot to control it, I started with a large power pack from a Cataphren and a partially trimmed down Skatari body, which I connected to the legs I built with a Doomcrawler weapon barrel and some plastic rod. I used a head from an Iron Strider pilot Skatari, and used some Taraxi arms, but swapped the weapon they were holding for one from a Tech Priest Manipulus. Taking an element from the Tallboys, I added some shield arms, made from Cataphren manipulators and Secutari shields, so the pilot isn't just a sitting duck up there. And to make it clear how the pilot was moving the unit, and lean into some mechanical body horror, I wanted it to look like the pilot's legs were plain metal rods directly plugged into ports, kind of like Daryl from Gundam Thunderbolt. So I replaced the lower legs of the Skatari I cut off with plastic rod, which connected to some smaller Cataphren arms that held the flamers I previously used to make the big legs. Then for a final pass of a few smaller details, I used smaller Cataphren manipulator arm parts as a kind of harness to hold the pilot in place at the waist and shoulders, some more spinal support made from Doomcrawler weapons, a searchlight piece from the Squat upgrade kit, an exhaust made from the Taraxi flamer I previously swapped out, and some antenna from the Sicarian kit. Then it was time to get to the last Skatros conversion to wrap up the trio. This one was a bit different. As mentioned, it was an early idea I had when I first saw the Skatros and wondered what I could do with the elevated gunman concept. It's a little silly and kinda plays into admech's anachronisms, where they have this mix of new and old technologies. I remember reading an excerpt from a codex that has stuck with me, about how a Skatari could have a punch card skull slot and leather bellows for lungs, whilst at the same time housing quantum bioware in his brain. This type of thing can be seen in their other models too, like the World War II style landing craft that hovers, and the Archaeopter with both jets and Da Vinci flying contraption style wings. And so the old idea comes from the Cities of Sigmar Fusel Major on Ogre Warhawk model, but obviously swapping out the parts for actual admech units. This also felt like a pretty easy thing to make too, just mount a Skatari on the admech equivalent of a bulky ogre, a Castellan robot. I just need to build the crow's nest and put it all together. So I assembled a Castellan out of old spare bits I had in my various boxes, along with a Skatari, just with its normal rifle swapped for the spare weapon option from the actual Skatros kit of my first build. For the crow's nest part, I started with a Doomcrawler weapon barrel and drilled in a slot for it into the top of the Castellan. Initially, I considered making the top part all from plasticard, as the Cities of Sigmar model part has a lot of flat sides, but in one of my bits boxes, I found one of the rounded sides of an Onager left over from my Onager tank head, which was the right shape, size, already had some admech style details, and even matched the rounded style of the Castellan a bit better. I also grabbed a walkway cover panel from some Zone Mechanicus terrain, which worked perfectly as a large shield for the Castellan, so I didn't have to make that element out of plasticard either. To properly put all those parts together, I drilled holes into the shield and arm to glue in a connector plastic rod, and for the crow's nest I used some plasticard to build out the sides and floor. But as always, plasticard is way too plain to use alongside densely detailed Warhammer parts, so there were a few things I did to decorate it. Firstly, I made some trim out of some 0.5mm plasticard, thin enough so I could bend it to wrap around the curved front, which also helped to obscure any uneven cuts of the previous plasticard. I also used another Secutari shield to cover the holes for the ladder rungs on the front of the Doomcrawler armour piece. Then I added bolt rivets from Zinja Industries and some other small details to the side. A camera device made from Cataphren head optics and the Skitari's backpack antenna, and some panels also made from plasticard to go on the other side. For some last few parts, I used a control panel from a Sydonian Dragoon and placed a small device from the Skitari's backpack on the Castellan's head and connected them all up with some green stuff wire. I wanted to try and imply the Skitari is controlling the Castellan in some way, since those robots usually have a datasmith overseer to give them commands. And finally, to finish all the building up, I made some of my usual admech industrial ruins type of base, which is just gridded and double diamond pattern plasticard, cut to match the base, with leftover green stuff wire and debris made from the offcuts of plasticard and any leftover bits. For the painting, I hope you don't mind if I go through it a bit quicker, as it's the same grey and orange scheme from my admech that I've gone over in quite a few of the videos now. I primed them all black, dry brushed the two main colours, grey and silver, heavily dry brushing Mechanicus Standard Grey and Iron Warriors for quick coverage, then lightly dry brushing Dawnstone and Tooth & Coats' Surcoat Silver on top of the respective grey and silver areas for some quick, rough highlighting. Then, I regularly painted the other main colours. Balthazar Gold for copper trim and some mechanical details, Ratskin Flesh for orange wires and later some patterns on top of the grey armour, Celestra Grey and Grey Seer for areas I'd go over with contrasts later, Dried Bark for the brown parts of the guns, and then Corn Red and Cabalite Green for some remaining wires. I used some of the same and some darker paints for the bases, dry brushing them with Iron Warriors, picking out a detail or two with Balthazar Gold, painting the wires with Corn Red and Warblock Bronze, then adding some of Proacryl's coarse grey earth texture paste. For the contrast paints, I used Athematic Blue for the eyes and optics, 2 coats of Corendras Green for screens, Iyanden Yellow for the searchlight, and Black Templar to go over a few wires for a darker finish. I also tried a code screen effect for the Castellan's face, starting from Grey Seer, shading with Nuln Oil so the edges are a bit darker, doing 1 coat of Corendras Green, then carefully painting lines and dots on top with more Grey Seer, then adding another coat of Corendras Green so the code squiggles are green and the rest of the screen is a deeper green. Once that was dry, I shaded the model, mostly with Nuln Oil but also using Agrax Earthshade for the browner parts, like the guns, and mixing both shades for the base, so they have a slightly dirtier, rustier tint. After that, I glued all the pieces together, getting them ready for final details and highlights. For the robot, it has a lot of large plain surface area, and lore-wise Castellans are old and repurposed tech, and some weathering would represent that well. I tried to go for some paint chipping and rusting effects, starting with mixing Corvus Black and Dried Bark to paint some black-brown patches and lines. To give them a bit of dimension, I painted the edges of those patches as finely as possible with Administratum Grey, not worrying if those lines are a little inconsistent, as it helps add a little variation. Then to make it look slightly rusty where the underlying metal is exposed, I applied some very thin down Mournfang Brown in small, sometimes streaking patches. Then, for the very last bit of weathering, and instead of the normal edge highlighting on the robot, I used the brighter greys Dawnstone and Administratum Grey to edge highlight inconsistently, and also add a few smaller marks and scratches. To finish off the non-armour parts of that model, and also the other minis, I just did a little basic edge highlighting, going over the most raised and prominent parts, either with their original paints or slightly brighter ones, like Dawnstone and Administratum Grey on the grey armour, Surcoats' silver on the metal and any rivets, and some mixed dried bark and Mournfang brown for the guns and their leather straps. And that's how I made these 3 Sydonian Skatros alternatives, from either remaking the proper Skatros kit, or making something else like it. I hope it gives a bit of insight into how I approach converting in kitbashing units, when I'd like something a little different from the official look to add to my expanding roster of custom admech units. Thanks for watching. If you want to keep up with what I'm making between videos, I post work in progress pictures regularly on Twitter, Instagram, and a few other places linked in the description. If you want to support me and get something out of it, you can use my Element Games affiliate link that I've used to link some of the kits from this build, along with some tools I commonly use. Or, if you want to support me more directly, I have a Patreon, where I post weekly project updates, future build ideas, building tips that anyone can view, and more. I'd like to thank those currently supporting me on Patreon, who are Kyra, The Lich's Laboratory, Morse Goenfree, Philip Mitchell, Talleyrand, Gamrus, Quirky Perceptions, Beedwag, Always Abe, PP, Fazea, and Yaroslav Altunen.